Good afternoon and welcome to the September 20th, 2023 City Council Work Session. Thank you for joining us in this virtual meeting format. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And thank you again for joining us. With that, I formally call this meeting of the City Council to order, and we'll turn it over to the manager for the first topic.
Thank you, Mayor. Our first topic is really related to SDCs and some changes and updates we need to make. And I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer Willer and let her introduce the topic and start the discussion.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, Mayor and City Council. I'm Jennifer Willer, the City Engineer and Division Manager for the Engineering Division of Public Works. And I do have a presentation here that I'm going to share my screen here. And hopefully you all see that now. And so like Sarah said, today I've brought you two issues on system development charges that seem timely and related to policies that this body has been working on. The first issue is to revisit the caps that were assigned to allowable adjustments to transportation SDCs charged to compact developments. And the second issue is to update the council on the legislation.
But I have to open this to get the camera.
Oops. And the second issue is to update the council on legislation that was passed in the 2023 session and how it potentially impacts future actions by the council. So the city has been collecting SDCs since 1978 as allowed in ORS and Eugene Code. They are collected for all new development and help the city make improvements that increase the capacity of the public systems and recoup a portion of the community's investment in reserve capacity already in place. So pursuant to these regulations, the city has adopted methodologies for each of these systems that dictate how the SDCs are calculated and assessed. In 2018, the council adopted an update to the transportation SDC methodology. This update included adjustments or reductions of the transportation SDC fee for certain compact developments. And there are 4 categories of compact developments that are eligible for this transportation SDC adjustment. So council is likely familiar with ADUs or accessory dwelling units, but just for clarity, the location-based developments include the Eugene Downtown Plan Boundary, the West University Commercial District, and residential mixed-use development along key corridors and nodal developments. The transit proximity includes development along frequent transit networks. And for developments that meet the location or transit proximity-based adjustment criteria, they may also qualify for a transportation demand management adjustment if there's an agreement with the city for actions that the development will take to reduce the transportation demand from the development or the need to construct capital facilities to address transportation growth. So as part of that SDC adoption or transportation SDC adoption, council included caps on the allowable adjustments. And these caps fell into 2 categories: a combined cap for the location, transit proximity, and TDM-based developments for $130,000 per year, and a separate cap for ADU development in the amount of $40,000 per year. These caps are adjusted annually for inflation, and any unallocated adjustments are rolled over for the following year. And when these caps were adopted, council asked staff to track their usage and to update council if the demand for the adjustments exceeded the cap amounts, because the intention was to provide budget surety or certainty rather than limit the incentives for this type of development. So this table is a record of the allocation of the combined location, transit, and TDM transportation SDC adjustments since their adoption. So this table works looking at FY19, the first year. We started with an initial allocation of $130,000. $76,663 of adjustments were applied that year to developments, with the remaining $53,337 allotment rolled over to FY20. And I want to note here that the information presented in the AIS has had some corrections and clarifications made, so this slide is slightly different than what was included in the AIS, and specifically looking at FY21 and FY22. So in FY21, we had more projects come in than available CDA or compact development adjustment allocation. But due to the timing of the projects, some projects received adjustments from FY21 and FY22. And I just didn't, portray that very well in the AIS table. But there were 2 projects whose timing could not wait until the FY22 allocation, and they did not receive the adjustment. And those 2 projects were eligible for a total adjustment of $118,000. We're still processing eligible projects submitted in FY23, but we are projecting to fully utilize the available adjustment. So this slide is a similar record for the ADU-based adjustments. And while this adjustment has seen allocations roll over each year, FY22's projects used up the rolled over balance as well as most of the annual allotment. And we are projecting fully allocating the available adjustment for FY23. So over the same period of time of these records, the city collected over $13 million in transportation SDC revenues. Between the shortfall in FY21 for the combined adjustments and the projected shortfall for the FY23 ADU adjustment, removing the caps would result in an approximate additional reduction in revenues of 0.8%, or $121,000 of the $13 million in revenue that we received. In addition to the commitment to update council on the use of compact development adjustments, in 2022, council gave its support for the Housing Implementation Pipeline, or HIP work plan. And there are 2 goals in the HIP that are relevant to this topic of compact development adjustments and caps. There is a HIP goal to consider ways to support development along key corridors, and the projects that are eligible for the combined location, transit proximity, and TDM-based adjustments are most often for residential or mixed-use developments along key corridors. There's also a goal in the HIP to identify opportunities to align SDC incentives with city housing goals. And eliminating both caps would ensure that all eligible projects receive this adjustment and would provide certainty for developers that they'll receive the adjustment for their eligible projects regardless of timing or other projects having preceded them that year. Elimination of the compact development adjustment caps would not impact the methodologies used to calculate the charges, and the elimination of the caps on transportation SDC compact adjustments is calculated to have a relatively small impact, that less than 1% additional reduction on overall transportation SDC revenues. The elimination of the caps would also align with the city goals, as I said, by providing surety that transportation SDC compact development adjustments can be accessed by all qualifying projects. So I went through that pretty quickly. I'm sure there are questions, but I'd like to take a few minutes to just get through the remaining slides, because it really is just a few more minutes, and then take all the questions at once. But before we transition to the next topic, just to summarize the compact development adjustment caps on transportation SDCs, that based on the information that I provided, the recommendation is to eliminate these caps, and that there is a proposed resolution in your packet to this effect. So earlier this year, the Oregon legislature passed House Bill 2984, which included provisions relating to the assessment of SDCs to buildings being converted from commercial to residential use. And there are two SDC provisions in this legislation that are relevant to Eugene. That cities may charge SDCs to these building conversions only if they have a specific policy on such conversions in place by December 31st, 2023, or that the SDC fee is for wastewater or water, and the SDC fee provides a credit for the wastewater or water SDCs paid when the building was originally constructed. So currently, Eugene does not have a specific policy on the assessment of SDCs for buildings converted from commercial to residential use. Rather, the SDCs are assessed to these developments based on their residential category for the proposed use. Eugene also has a relatively generous previous use credit that is applied to all new development that offsets the SDCs charged with a credit for their most intensive previous use for each SDC system. So this means that Eugene's previous use credit is not limited to previous SDCs paid or the original building construction. In reviewing the hearing testimony for HB 2984, the legislative intent was that agencies were thoughtful about how their SDC policies were applied to these developments. And the challenge is that the city was given a pretty short time frame in the legislation to adopt such a policy. As I mentioned earlier, the City Council adopted the HIP work plan that included the goal to identify opportunities to align SDC incentives with city housing goals, which means this topic is relevant to discussions and analysis that the city was already planning to have. Given that the city's previous use credit is pretty generous, and in order to reserve the right to continue to work on and discuss this topic, the recommendation is to adopt a policy that allows for the continuation of charging SDCs to these building conversions pursuant to applicable residential categories. If this council doesn't want to adopt that policy, then to prevent being in conflict with state law, we would be looking for direction from council on a different policy regarding SDCs for conversion of buildings from commercial to residential use for adoption prior to that December 31st, 2023 deadline. And I believe Emily Jerome from the City Attorney's Office is online and would be able to walk council through that process if it was needed. So to sum up the recommendations in your AIS packet, the first is to adopt a resolution in attachment B to eliminate the cap on compact development adjustments to transportation system development charges. And the second is to adopt a resolution in attachment C. I will note that a corrected version was just sent out to eliminate a reference to water SDCs, since that's not something that the city charges. But it is a resolution to adopt a policy regarding system development charges for conversion of buildings from commercial to residential use in non-industrial zones. And that is the end of my presentation. I went through a lot of information pretty quickly here, so I thank you for your time, and I am happy to answer any questions that you have.
Hey, thank you very much. It's really interesting. These are interesting questions, and in some ways it feels like in both cases a good problem to have, which is we have development going in and people are using those SDC opportunities and waivers, and that's a good thing. So it's and I think it's interesting the door that the state has opened regarding commercial conversions. So are there counselors with questions? Yeah, Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. This is more of a procedural question for Jennifer. In the motions, I haven't had a chance. I just got the modification. I haven't had a chance to read through that yet. Does that change anything in motion 2?
It does not.
Thank you.
All right, any?
I mean, I guess I should actually let Catherine or Emily say that, because I don't know if you want to say something different about it being a corrected attachment C.
No, it's fine. The motion can stay the same. And just to be clear, we sent out a replacement resolution because I included a reference to water SDCs in the original resolution, and the city of Eugene doesn't charge water SDCs. So the only change is deletion of the word water from the policy. It just reflects that we will not be charging water SDCs for these conversions.
Thank you. I just did not want to read the wrong motion.
I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Alan?
Regarding the first part of the motion, or the first motion, so if when you pulled up slides 6 and 7, which are the tables of the amounts, they're a little bit confusing to me, but the bottom line of that is that we put in a cap because we were unsure about how much was actually going to be asked for, and we didn't want to have a budget breaker kind of thing. But from these two tables, it doesn't seem like that occurred. It was very modest, and that's question one. Is that correct? And B, is that going to stay correct, so that if we lift this cap, this won't be a problem in the future? I assume this is so because you guys are recommending lifting the cap, but I wanted to ask the question anyway.
So you are correct in how you've interpreted the information. What these tables don't show is any kind of jockeying or complexity in trying to get the timing just right so that there is cap available. So if you came in at the end of the year, maybe you have to wait until the next year to finalize your permit to make sure that you get the allocation. And this just eliminates that need to kind of manage and fiddle with your timing of your projects to ensure that you get the cap. Or
yes,
get the
Which
allotment.
could actually end up
Yeah, and if we end up
delay, right?
and the intent is if we end up in a situation where suddenly it really is a budget issue, and we can always come back and reintroduce a cap, but we don't see that as being an issue.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments on this one? Emily?
Thank you. I'm glad this is coming back, because I remember when we talked about it the first time, and I was against having a cap because I didn't want to have anybody be eliminated from the chance. So I think it's the right thing to do. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. If there are no other questions or comments, I'm going to just turn it to Randy to put a motion. Well, he's got two motions on the table.
Thank you, Mayor. Motion 1. Move to adopt the resolution and attachment B to this AIS to eliminate the cap on compact development adjustments to transportation system development charges.
Second.
All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That passes unanimously. Thank you. Next one.
Thank you, Mayor. Second motion, move to adopt the resolution and attachment C to this AIS to adopt a policy regarding system development charges for conversion of buildings from commercial to residential use in non-industrial zones.
Second.
All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Well, appreciate that for important changes. Went very quickly. So thank you for that very clear presentation. And I think with that, we are ready to transition to our next agenda item.
Thank you, Mayor. I will just add to what you said. This has been a full circle for me on the last item, and it is one of the examples where we said, trust us, we'll pay attention, we'll come back if there's an issue. And so to come back and actually be able to remove the cap feels really good and aligned with your previous policy direction and your strategic goals around housing. So that is really fun. And right before you left on break, we had some discussion about in your building electrification, about coming back soon after break to talk about all the work we're doing around climate and how things can move forward this fall. And so Ian Penn is here, and he's going to talk about all of that and more.
Thank you, City Manager, and good afternoon, Mayor and City Council. I am Ian Penn, Sustainability Manager, and happy to be with you this afternoon. So I'm going to try and share my screen here. So just a quick summary of what I'm hoping to cover with you all today. I wanted to first start with an overview of the two major federal climate-related funding bills that are out there, then spend a little bit of time talking about the key elements of the recently passed state climate resilience package, which is going to have a potentially big impact in Eugene as well. Also talk a little bit about what city staff have been doing to try and track and position Eugene to try and leverage these state and federal opportunities, and then just a brief overview of some of the building decarbonization engagement work that's actually now underway. So at the federal level, there are really two primary federal bills that have significant climate-related funding opportunities. The first is the bipartisan infrastructure law, which provides $1.2 trillion in total spending over 5 years through competitive and formula-based programs. And then the second is the Inflation Reduction Act, which represents nearly $400 billion in new programs and incentives to spur climate and clean energy investments. And just for sort of ease of purposes, for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to refer to both of these laws as Bill and IRA, just to cut down on some of the wording. So digging in a little bit deeper on Bill was really created against the backdrop of a lot of underinvestment in infrastructure going back decades. And so roads, bridges, water infrastructure. And so really a focus on trying to do some more substantive investment on that front. And if you look at the $1.2 trillion in total spending under that bill, the law included over $500 billion in new federal funding for infrastructure. And the breakdown in new spending is the focus of this chart that you actually see in front of you. And as you can see from that chart, more than half of the new funding is for transportation infrastructure. This can be surface transportation, airports, and things like EV charging infrastructure. About 60% of bill funding is going to be delivered to states via formula. And so what that means for local governments is that governments are able to access bills funding through either sub-allocations from state agencies or competitively through state or federal grant programs. Bill's a huge bill. And so there are hundreds of funding opportunities under Bill, but in thinking about some of the areas where the city can and really already has been pursuing funding opportunities to support our climate-related goals, this is just a few highlights from that. Energy efficiency and conservation block grants. Really, these are grants allocated to Eugene by formula to support strategies to reduce emissions and improve energy efficiency. There's a program focused on resilient building codes. This is really designed to help states and cities modernize their building code through technical assistance, community engagement, and other types of resources. For this particular program, the City of Eugene has actually partnered with Earth Advantage, the state, and some other cities across Oregon on a grant under this program, really focused on going after building energy benchmarking. And then last, EV charging infrastructure. And those grants really have a focus on trying to deploy stations and EV charging infrastructure in rural and low-income communities. This is another area where the city, through some of its partnership, in this case, partnering with Lane County and eWeb, have pursued funding to deploy EV charging infrastructure under this program. We haven't heard about this yet, but we're expecting a decision on a grant that we went after sometime this fall. Moving a little bit more onto IRA. IRA really builds on bill investments by providing $390 billion in clean energy spending and incentives, with many programs really focused on targeting low-income and disadvantaged communities. IRA is big, not as big as Bill, but there are around 100 programs under IRA, so a lot of programs to provide resources, with funds really being delivered through a mix of grants, tax incentives, direct federal spending, and things like loan guarantees. I think an important point in looking at IRA is that much of the benefit is actually going to be seen through the tax code rather than through competitive grants and other funding. This includes both business tax credits, which I think is the biggest segment of Bill, and then tax credits that are going to be available to individuals and households. The value of this tax credit was initially estimated at $27 billion, but I think an important thing to note is that they're actually uncapped. So the total value could actually be 2 or 3 times that figure. And I think one of the challenges and one of the opportunities is to get as much participation and as much utilization of these tax credits as possible to leverage as much of that benefit over the next 10 years as we possibly can. But I think sort of the areas of IRA that I really wanted to draw council's attention to are where Eugene can advance some of its climate and energy goals right now. And this is really primarily going to be done through 2 parts of IRA. One are the various competitive grants that are available to states, local governments, community-based organizations. And the second are, again, the tax incentives, both business incentives, but also the incentives for individuals and households to really help them transform their energy consumption and use. And so what really are the key areas for Eugene to advance some of its climate and clean energy goals? And so thinking about that, I've kind of identified 5 broad themes and some of the opportunities under IRA to maybe try and support them and help some of those goals. So in thinking about how we can improve building stock and do energy efficiency, there's a number of programs, but I think one of the big ones is an $8.8 billion program called the Home Efficiency and Electrification Rebate Program. This is something that's going to be implemented by states, and it's really intended for those households who may not actually be able to take advantage of some of the individual tax credits under IRA. How this program has been designed is actually, I think, kind of helpful in illustrating how sort of really big piles of federal money become smaller, but also important piles of state money. And so of that $8.8 billion, Oregon received about $113 million via a formula-based approach. And then the Oregon Department of Energy is actually going to be standing up 2 different rebate programs using that money, using those resources. And thinking about opportunities to improve local air quality and reduce emissions, there's a number of programs here. I think the 2 big ones, one is the $5 billion Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program. This is really designed for states, tribes, local governments to plan, implement near-term greenhouse gas emission reduction and pollution reduction strategies. There's a big impact on pollutant benefits and how those might be developed as part of projects. In Oregon, this is a 2-phase program. Phase 1 is planning, kind of developing state-based climate action plans. The second phase is then using those plans to then go after money to implement projects. For the planning phase in Oregon, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality is actually leading a lot of the state level planning for that work right now. And then the second fund, it's probably the biggest single source of funding, is the $27 billion Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Of this, about $7 billion is going to go to states, really to help them deploy zero emissions energy technologies. This is likely going to be really heavily focused on residential solar and community solar. And then there's going to be $20 billion that's really going to go to some national financial nonprofits, with the goal of those organizations should then be providing finances for climate and clean energy projects, really focusing on identifying projects and opportunities in underserved communities. And thinking a little bit about community resilience, there's a number of funds here. I think one of the really more interesting ones is $3 billion for what is called the Environmental and Climate Justice Block Grant. These are really for community-led projects that are designed to reduce air pollution, help improve pollution monitoring, and really do things like build political capacity. These are really designed to be really flexible grants and to focus on projects that are designed by and designed for communities. So really focusing on sort of that equity lens and how we can apply that to projects in our communities. And then $1.5 billion under the Urban and Community Forestry Program. This is really to get more tree cover in urban spaces and boost equitable access to nature. This is a program that's actually going to be implemented through the states, but staff have already been talking with the state office about how Eugene can participate in this program and take advantage of that locally. It's a good opportunity to supplement things like street trees. So there's a good opportunity there. And then thinking about the transportation sector, there's a number of programs here as well. I think the big one is $1 billion really designed to replace heavy-duty vehicles with zero-emission alternatives for those types of vehicles. And so I think if you look at all the different IRA funding and what's going on there, one of the really common themes that keeps showing up across these programs is really a strong focus on projects and work that's really going to benefit underserved populations and areas. So that equity lens is something that federal agencies are looking for. It's showing up in project proposals. It's showing up in how federal agencies are actually screening how we can do. So a lot of our thinking locally is how do we design and think about projects through that equity lens. And then the last elements are really taking advantage of those tax credits, because much of or the biggest benefit under IRA is going to be through the tax code. That's really going to be a key area to try and advance some of our climate goals. And there's going to be a number of things that are going to play into that. I think probably the biggest one is just simply making businesses and individuals just aware of and probably helping them access some of these tax credits. There's going to be things like tax credits to buy both new and used EVs. The used part of that is interesting. That's possibly going to open up new incentives and new markets for those vehicles. And then under IRA, there's a new mechanism called elective pay. And what that is that basically allows tax-exempt entities, so places like the city who don't have tax burdens, to receive a rebate payment from the IRS. And that rebate would be potentially equal to up to the full value of some of the tax credits for qualifying projects and tax credits that used to be only available to the business community and to people who had tax burdens. So that's potentially something really interesting to help advance sort of clean energy projects across Eugene. So then focusing a little bit at the state level. So in addition to sort of the two large federal climate related bills, what's called the Climate Resilience Package was passed at the end of the most recent state legislative session. Basically, these are two omnibus bills that both introduce new mandates and some new programs for the Department of Energy at the states, but also create incentives and some regulations for climate work on buildings, green infrastructure, transportation, resilience. So there's a lot of things coming out of this bill that can be really important and are really, really important opportunities to also leverage. The package, it's really been described as $90 million in state investments to leverage significant federal resources. And the state budget has also included some additional funding for some existing climate and clean energy programs. So when those are stood up and funded, figuring out, again, how to take advantage of those is going to be an important part of this conversation locally as well. So the two climate resilience bills include probably nearly 20 smaller bills, but I think just a few key programs that were included. First, with building performance standards, I think sort of at their most basic, these are really intended to establish targets for large commercial buildings with the goal of having them both benchmark and ultimately reduce their energy use or reduce their greenhouse gas emissions over time. I think the state rules for this, once they're developed, are actually going to really help decarbonize some of our larger commercial buildings, both in Eugene, but also across the state. So could be a really impactful policy mechanism at the state level. Heat pumps was a big focus in this bill. The bill set a goal of installing 500,000 heat pumps statewide by 2030 with a priority on low income and environmental justice communities. I think this goal, coupled with IRA tax credits, rebates from the state, incentives from utilities, is going to have potentially a really big impact on residential buildings in Eugene and is a really important opportunity to track and take advantage of. The one-stop shop, the idea of this is really to try and create a single resource to help residents just better understand the incentives and rebates that might be available to them. And then the Community Navigator complements the one-stop shop, really trying to help focus on helping tribes and environmental justice communities understand the resources and funding opportunities available specifically to them and to give them some support in trying to take advantage of this as well. And then finally, there was something called the Community Green Infrastructure Grant Program that's intended really to fund community projects that, again, increase tree canopy and access to green space, really all across the state. So, there's a lot going on. That's a really quick taste of that. But I think the primary take home for council is that while there's a lot going on, there's also a lot of opportunity. And so staff have really been focusing at both sort of the policy and the program level, really to figure out how to best position Eugene to take advantage of or have a voice in the conversation of how to best maximize this opportunity. Kind of at a very high level, work has been done just to see how these different programs align with CAP 2.0, some of the actions and projects we have there. Staff have been tracking active opportunities under both the federal bills and opportunities at the state level, seeing how programs are being designed, what are the eligibility requirements, what is the cost share, things like that, using that as a way to think about what grants should be pursued. Do they align with ongoing working goals? But I think a challenge in all of this has been how to best use sort of limited internal resources, how to assess what types of proposals are likely to have the greatest chance of success, and really what are the funds that we think are likely to move quickly or can be leveraged quickly. But that all just requires time and effort. And so we've been spending a lot of time trying to focus on where are the sort of highest value, greatest opportunities that we can try to pursue through some of this. But I think what's really important here is that this is really an opportunity to think much more broadly about what role the city can actually play to try and spur progress on climate. Some of that can just be relatively simple, just helping to raise awareness of opportunities maybe the city is not eligible for, but there could be organizations in town. And if they were to be awarded or get some of those resources, that's going to help our community. That's going to help us achieve our goals. And I think just generally helping the community and, just better understand, be aware of, and access some of these relevant incentives and some of these different opportunities. I also think another point of emphasis for staff has really been sort of that coordination and relationship building part of this, really having conversations at the local level, with the state, at the federal level, really trying to determine kind of what is actually needed to try and take advantage of this opportunity. A lot of these conversations have been ongoing. They're going to continue to be ongoing. Just a couple of examples may be helpful. For one example, Mayor Vinis, along with Ethan Nelson, they've been meeting with ODO Director Janine Benner, really to discuss a number of things, but I think to figure out, how IRA resources are actually going to flow to the state. And I think importantly, what is the role of cities in implementing IRA funding, kind of what that is. Another example, something related to ongoing regional discussions concerning the climate pollution reduction grant I previously mentioned. That's the $5 billion program that has a planning activity going on right now. We'll be transitioning into implementation. It's a two-phase program. What we've been doing is there have been some discussions with local and regional partners, really trying to think about, are there potential project ideas to consider for going after during the implementation phase, as well as some ongoing negotiations or conversations with DEQ. DEQ is leading the planning effort. They will ultimately develop a state climate plan that will be submitted to EPA. That plan will be used as the basis for pursuing implementation funding as the next phase. And so really talking to DEQ to better understand kind of what is their scope, what is their work, and then really trying to figure out and talk about how can Eugene and the region's interest in projects be reflected in that plan so that we can position to potentially go after some of those implementation funds. So there's a lot going on, but I think a lot of these conversations are continuing to build those relationships and figure out how we can take advantage of this opportunity as much as possible. And then just to dig into kind of the last bullet, which is sort of the idea of a program manager. And I think as we've been having some of these conversations and realizing all these different resource streams that exist out there, one of the ways that it seems like helping to ensure that all the available funding and incentive opportunities are maximized is really to figure out how we can combine and leverage some of those funding and incentives from various sources. There's going to be resources from utilities. EWEB has their programs. The state's going to have rebates and grants. There's incentives through the tax code. But it's complicated. There's a lot of moving pieces. There's not necessarily one entity that covers everything. And I think we're trying to figure out, how do you leverage that to take advantage of as many of these opportunities that can be combined with each other as possible? And so if you think about something like a whole house energy retrofit, or like a deep energy retrofit for a house, one way to approach that would be to sort of have some sort of single point of contact, a program manager, to consolidate funding, provide program services, and really help homeowners, business owners understand and really take advantage of all the different incentives that might be available. And so the program manager idea would be to allow residents, building owners kind of understand what are their retrofit needs, access the contractors, and really get help accessing all the various resources from these different funding sources. What's available from the utility? What's available from the state? Can they be used together? Are they exclusive? And just helping people walk through that process, really with the goal of how can we figure out to get as much participation and use of this as possible, because that's really going to help us sort of leverage this opportunity and make a great deal of progress towards some of our climate goals. So staff have been talking to organizations who could potentially provide this sort of service. We've been tracking some pilots that are being done in other cities, kind of dabbling with and looking at sort of this opportunity. And we're also following what's going on at the state level with their one-stop shop, really trying to see, as that's being developed, does that fit what we're seeing as a local need, or is there going to continue to be a local need for this type of service? And so lastly, just to touch a little bit on building decarbonization. So as the city manager mentions, council, after council's decision in July on the ordinance, staff have begun the process of beginning some engagement on building decarbonization. While staff were not able to talk in the early part of the year, we've been doing some behind the scenes planning and thinking about how to do this. But we've now started to have some of these conversations, really focusing initially on conversations with underrepresented communities and some initial conversations with the commercial sector. But we're going to be broadening those efforts to a much wider group of stakeholders over the coming months as we continue to roll out this program. I think something that staff had discussed with council last year, there's a lot of different engagement efforts either going on or being planned all across the city. So one of the things staff have been doing is talking internally with our colleagues from planning, from the Office of Equity and Community Engagement, really about ways in which we can coordinate on engagement, as we're going to be targeting a lot of the same stakeholder groups, and how can we both be efficient and effective in how we're trying to do some of that work. I think similarly, what we're trying to do is kind of learn from some of these engagement efforts and some of the data collection and information that's been gathered over the years from some of these prior efforts. So looking at previous engagement efforts, information that's been accumulated, really trying to have much more targeted conversations so that we can be much more productive in the type of information we're gathering, really as a way to try and identify tangible and specific recommendations coming out of this process. And so if you look at kind of the very high level timeline that's on the chart in front of you, staff are intending to come back to council and report on some of the opportunities and strategies that exist, provide feedback that we've been hearing from different stakeholders, their concerns, the opportunities, the challenges, where the city can help and provide incentives. Policy recommendations, and a hope for that is for some of the policy recommendations is including how we might be able to align some of this building decarbonization work with some of these various resource opportunities that are out there. And I think, ran through a lot. I'm sure there's going to be some questions, but I am happy to take this as an opportunity to respond to any questions and take some feedback.
Thank you so much, Ian. That was such a terrific presentation. And, I have been tracking this all along and part of these conversations, and it's still hard to keep track of what all the pieces are. And you just did a super job of laying it out for us. I really, really appreciate that. And I do have a lineup, and I lost track of whether Randy or Alan was first in this queue, but it was Alan. Okay, so Alan, you're up.
Thank you. Great overview, Ian. Thank you for that. A lot of information. I'm glad we're having this discussion. I think it's absolutely critical that we phase down and phase out the fossil fuel use to address climate change in our community and across the nation, across the world, actually. But it seems we've not kept our eye on the prize, which is to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions to prevent the costly and difficult impacts of climate change, and to focus actually on implementing actions that significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And at the same time, take advantage of the amazing amount of federal and state dollars and programs that are available to help Eugene reduce its greenhouse gas emissions cost effectively. Unfortunately, and not surprisingly, we stumbled into a culture war. And as predicted, we spent about 5 years spinning our wheels and reduced exactly zero greenhouse gas emissions. Regrettable, but very avoidable outcome. But it's time to pivot. It's time to shift our focus and do actions that actually can benefit Eugene businesses and households and the city while reducing significant amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm really excited about turning our attention to partnering with the state of Oregon and the federal government. Oregon allocated, as Ian said, $90 million in this last session to climate change, and that was on top of the many programs and regulations already adopted by the state and that are already in existence. And then there on top of that is the billions of dollars of the federal funding that's being made available. And that, by the way, if we implemented all of the state greenhouse gas programs that are already adopted, we would meet our greenhouse gas emission goal of 2035, as shown by the Oregon Global Warming Commission's TIGR analysis. And so I think our focus needs to be helping Oregon make sure all of those programs succeed and take advantage of the immense amount of incentives that we can direct to our people and businesses in Eugene, take advantage of that, and as well as benefit the city directly. So at the same time, as Council previously directed in the motion in the last slide, engaging our people and businesses about the need to transition away from fossil fuels and electrify as many processes as we can that's cost effectively as we can is really an important part of what we should be doing. So while this task is urgent, how we do it and what we focus on is particularly important. And so there is more than one recipe to make a cake. And I think we're on the right track. I'm so excited to be back on track and doing actions that actually benefit the people financially and reduce significant greenhouse gases so we can make our CRO goals. Of course, one of my biggest concerns is after going through all of that we don't have enough personnel to take advantage of all this. So I'm very interested in the project manager and adding more resources to leverage the millions of dollars and bringing them to Eugene so we can maximize the benefit to all of us.
Okay, thank you. Next up is Randy and then Greg.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Ian. I thought that was an excellent presentation. It was nice to see how some of the dots could be connected, especially with financial help, which is something I've been worried about. I agree with just about everything Councilor Zelenka said. I think it's time to pivot and that we look at what we can do, not just to be moving towards sustainable energy sources, but also how do we reduce our energy consumption? One of the prime ways of doing that is increased weatherization and more efficient heating and cooling equipment. With that said, I like that there's a tax credit element for the consumer and also businesses. I'm interested in knowing what can we do if we're able to get some of this federal and state funding. What can we do in the way of developing a weatherization program that we have funding to support?
So I think there's a number of opportunities there. I agree. I think it's probably twofold. I think one is trying to figure out just to make people aware of and to take advantage of the tax-based incentives that are there. But I think in terms of there's going to be a gap. And I think there's probably two things. I think one is the 2 rebate programs that are going to be developed at the state level with that funding and making sure that we're taking advantage of that. We're tracking, it's taken a while for those rules to be developed at the federal level. Now the state's going to take their turn to develop those rules and figure out that's going to be rebate based. Some of it's going to be point of sale. So I think there's a number of things. I think there's education of contractors. There's education of people who are doing the work in the field. And I think it's making people aware of this opportunity, whether that's through a program manager role, whether that's something the city takes on. That's probably one avenue. There are weatherization efforts that are ongoing through other organizations within the community. There might be opportunities to sort of supplement what they're already doing because they already have experience on the ground doing some of that work. I don't know if we've necessarily thought about standing up a city program yet. I think we want to figure out kind of where the resources are flowing, where they're going to be available, and what might be available to us, and then use that as a way to figure out what are the gaps. EWEB does weatherization, St. Vinny's does weatherization. There's a lot of different areas that are covering that. We're trying to understand where their coverage is and then figure out what is not being covered by that. The rental market might be one area, and that seems like a tough nut to crack. And so there are other opportunities to bring resources there where maybe there is a better opportunity. Anecdotally, I live in a rented house. It's not particularly energy efficient. It could benefit from some weatherizations, but we have to come up with the right incentives, and whether that's from the city or whether that's working with the state and figuring out how to do that. I think there's a bunch of opportunities. I don't know if I have a program in mind right now, but that is clearly something that I think is going to be important. And I think it's going to be critical to make sure that this works effectively. It's not just putting in a heat pump, it's making sure that the building envelope is buttoned up and that you have good windows and everything else. So it's a system that you're trying to do and develop in such a way that you're really maximizing all of the technology opportunities that are out there to really take advantage of reducing our energy consumption and our emissions.
I've been in a lot of structures over the years through my prior life, and my observation has been some of our poorest people live in some of the least energy efficient domiciles. And so to me, this has a big equity piece as well, and trying to work with landlords to help them increase the value of their property and in turn help offset some of the costs for the renters, which are being, especially those who are living in pre-1995 construction, has some of the worst energy loss. So I would be very interested in hearing more about that. I don't know that we need to create the programs, but if there's a way we can help get the funding and channel it to programs that are already being effective out there, I think that's going to be incredibly important. And it seems like there almost needs to be 3 channels here: one for residential, one for landlords who are renting out residential, and then one for commercial/industrial. Another thing I was glad to see on climate resiliency that it included trees, and if we can help accelerate some of our street trees program, that will help with cooling and try to help control some of our temperature spikes. And then also any thoughts around emergency management and even trying to develop energy sources if we have a large seismic event that kind of isolates us here locally. What can we do to work with our utilities to help have systems in place that allow us to generate our own power?
On the last point first, I think one of the things I didn't cover, because there's a lot of things I didn't cover, as part of the climate resiliency package, there is resources for local resilience hubs. A lot of that is really community driven, but it's helping communities both respond to and be resilient to events that are potentially disruptive. And there are also conversations with, between eWeb, with the university, with what's going on at the yard, to try and create these nodes of how do you keep the power up? How do you keep services going? How do you provide other services? So I think it's, again, kind of a regional conversation where each sort of entity has kind of their focus and their skill and their expertise, and then coming up with that more holistic package. But there are resources available for doing that at the county level and for doing that at the city level and the community level that's going to be part of both federal funding as well as funding that's going to be coming from the state through the climate resilience package. So I think that's really important.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say on the resiliency, yes, I know that park staff have been talking to the state about figuring out how we can take advantage of some of those resources to really supplement some of the street trees work that we're doing as a way, particularly in West Eugene and some of the areas that don't have as much access to green space, and how we can benefit that both from a green space, but also a climate and air pollution perspective.
Great. Well, I'm just eager to learn more about this, and especially at the end here, interested. Oh, I thought I had 5 seconds left. I'm sorry.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if that's over or under. Sorry.
Okay. Well,
he has about 20 seconds left. We had a timer issue, so I'm timing.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Randy.
Well, thank you. So anyway, I would love to learn some more about that. In fact, maybe you and I can meet separately, because the resiliency and how do we still sustain and protect our community after the lights go off is incredibly important to me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Greg and then Jennifer.
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks, Ian, for the presentation. I have about 5 questions. I'm consolidating down to 2. So the first one is concerning the equity lens. And the equity lens is going to be an important tool for us to be able to assess, how we are delivering these services to our underserved communities. So my first question is, has the equity lens been developed? Where is the equity lens coming from? Is that coming from the state? Will we be developing or applying an equity lens on a municipal level? And how are we able to, take the assessments from that equity lens and apply them to the communities that are most underserved and need the most help as quickly as possible? Ian?
And you're still muted.
Sorry, I'm muted. My apologies. So I think the big part of this is a lot of the federal funding is asking applicants to basically use the Justice 40 tool, which is a tool that's been stood up by White House, the White House. And it's kind of that initial screen. So, for example, the EV charging infrastructure grants that I mentioned that the city went after in partnership with eWeb and the county, some of the initial screening and thinking about where we might, within the city boundary, do siting for some of these locations, use that as one of the screening methodologies for doing that. So to understand where across Eugene are applicable census tracts, and using that as one of the screening levels to think about where we would do siting for EV charging infrastructure. That's being applied in other ways as well, but that's one of the things that comes out of a lot of these funding opportunities, is using that tool. There are a couple of different tools part of that. I think it has to be done, and some of that's going to be using some of these federal tools. There are tools at the state level as well. I know as some of our GIS information that we have is, locally, through LCOG, has a lot of that is, folding that information into some of the GIS screening there happens also. And so all these applications require this, so we're going to have to do that. I also think some of this engagement work is going to help us identify this as well. We're trying to understand, particularly, low-income communities who are primarily going to be renters, who are going to be disproportionately impacted both by climate and by changes in, they're already energy secure, they're already cost insecure. And so understanding, where they are and how some of those, challenges can actually be served from some of these resources is an important part of what we're trying to do. So I think the equity lens kind of already exists. It's things that the city has done. It's done with grants it's pursued, and there are tools at the federal level to help with some of this evaluation as well, to basically feed into that. And it's going to be critical. I think a lot of the feedback that we've seen is that, if you don't have project proposals that include kind of this meaningful equity component, you're probably not going to be awarded some of this grant. So I think we've recognized that it's a critical part of that, and it's understanding, and again, it's part of that partnership and coordination. Who are the right community partners to talk to and identify what those opportunities are, and use that as a way to kind of develop that project pipeline to go after some of these resources.
So that leads me my second question, and that is about the program manager. So that would be a new position. Would that be under your department? And I'm also thinking about the program manager having a lot of responsibilities in terms of coordinating federal, state, and local programs, and trying to align those programs in ways that will make it much more useful for residential as well as commercial consumers to be able to engage these programs and get those funds quickly and efficiently to projects that they are trying to implement in their own, whether it's their house or their business or whatever the case may be. So can you talk a little bit more about how the program manager is going to be funded? Where is that program manager going to be housed? And what other things are going to be needed in terms of support for that position to make that a much more efficient and way of getting these services into the right hands?
And I think the second half of what you just talked about is exactly the purpose, is how do we figure out how we can maximize this opportunity and make people aware and help people walk through this. This is complicated. As somebody who spends a lot of time looking at this, I find it complicated. So people who are trying to, feed their families and work jobs and do this is just more than they probably can handle. In terms of where it's going to be housed, I don't think we were necessarily seeing this as being a city position. I think this is something that we were thinking about sort of outsourcing and having contractor services provide this. There are organizations out there that do pieces of this. There are organizations up in Portland who do some of this work. And, this is not necessarily a need unique to Eugene. There are a lot of cities sort of talking about this and thinking about this. And there are organizations kind of being stood up. Block Power is a name that people have heard. They sort of had sort of a splashy entrance into the national scene about a year ago. There are other organizations in Portland, Community Energy Project. So I think the thinking was to contract with an outside organization who could do all of that, because you need a lot of different expertise. I'm not sure like one person could handle this, because you need financial expertise, you need legal expertise, you need policy analysis, you need some engineering expertise. And there are probably organizations who are more well equipped to do this. And the thinking was, although I'm not adverse to having somebody part of the program, the thinking was to get outside support to serve this role. In terms of the funding, I think we're trying to figure out kind of what the cost structure and what the service levels will be. An interesting project that we're following right now is actually an RFP that the city of Chicago put out. They were kind of a couple of years ahead of us in their decarbonization conversation, but they did kind of this community engagement. They came up with a roadmap, and then they put out a request for information to kind of see what organizations exist that can provide this service. And they had a little bit of ARPA money, $15 or $20 million. And so they put out an RFP recently, and they're going to award that to an organization to do some of this work. And we want to track and see how that works for them, and see kind of, what are the pitfalls, what are the opportunities, as a way to think about, does it make sense to contract, or would it actually make more sense to stand up something internally? I don't know that we thought about that initially. And the thought was to kind of dip our toe in the pool and figure out, is there a way to contract with somebody so that they can actually provide all the different pieces of information that are going to be needed for this? But I think I'd be willing to think more about having an internal person do that and provide that. But I think that's the idea. I think there was a pilot that Beyond Toxics has been doing in Bethel. That's a clean energy project. And they've been trying to work with a couple of local residents. And we're finding it's really labor intensive. They're working with a couple of households, and they are probably 2,000 person hours into this work. So there's a lot of work, a lot of resources, a lot of information needed to be brought. And I think we want to figure out what is the way to do this in the most cost-effective way. That might be having a staff person. That might also be, having, an outside person. In terms of funding, I think one of the things that we're having as part of these regional conversations is, can we use some of these federal resources to fund some of this work? And so one of the things that we've talking with the county is maybe we could stand up a county level program manager. So Eugene can benefit, Springfield can benefit, Oak Ridge can benefit, Florence can benefit, and there might be opportunities to create a regionally based program that could allow all of us to take advantage of this and create benefits in Eugene, but also across the county. So I think I don't think I'm set in stone. I think we're trying to figure out what the best pathway would be, recognizing this being a really important need.
Thanks. That's helpful. That's really helpful. I just want to note, it's going to be important where and how this thing is set up and where it's going to be housed, and whether it's the city, the county, or we do some kind of outsourcing, it's going to be critical. This is a position that's critical to making sure that we get these resources to our most underserved communities.
Hey, thank you. Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. And thank you, Ian. Was very impressed with your presentation and your answers today. Greg and I must be in sync today because he had the same questions I did. So thankfully they're already answered. I'm wondering, do you think, and I may have misunderstood what Alan was trying to say, but do you think it's accurate that we've been making no progress over the last 5 years, Ian? And because that's not how it feels to me. I know we haven't done everything we've wanted, but it feels like we have made progress. So I'm just, from your perspective, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, so I've been here a year, so I'm maybe
that's true. That might not be fair.
I do. I mean, I think so. In thinking about, so one of the ways we try to measure progress is every 2 years we do a greenhouse gas inventory for the community. And I think if you look at the most recent inventory that we had for the city, which was in calendar 2021, which was finished last fall, we found that we had reduced fossil fuel use by 14%. Relative to our baseline. So there has been progress. It probably hasn't been enough. And I think one of the challenges is a lot of this can be incremental. So a huge part of what we're trying to do for our climate goals is on transportation and related to implementation of transportation projects. And these aren't necessarily things you can do overnight. So I do think we have made progress. We probably haven't moved at the pace we need to, certainly not to meet the moment of the challenge. But I think this is also one of those unicorn funding opportunities where we can establish like a really strong foundation to hopefully really accelerate this and really put this, sort of on steroids and help move some of this, because I think part of it is, how do you create the incentives to get people to, incorporate and use new technologies? And I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that I do think we have made progress. It probably just hasn't been as quickly or as far as I think we all hope for, and sort of is laid out in the CRO.
Yeah. And I think I really like your idea of some type of project manager. I guess I'm concerned, probably like many people, is that this is a moment in time where there's a lot of opportunity, and if we're not ready and we don't have our our stuff in a place where we can take advantage of this, someone else is going to get it, right? So I feel really confident with you in this role, because it sounds like you've really got a handle on it, and you're getting all the information you can and getting people together. So I really look forward to updates along the way and how council can support staff and you and our whole community on getting this done and getting those resources here locally, so that we can make that progress that we all want to see. Thank you so much, Ian.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Alan has his hand up for a second round. Does anyone who hasn't had a first round want to jump in here? Not yet? Okay, Alan, go for it.
Yeah, actually, I was referring to council effort and focus. There are other areas where the city and the Eugenians have made real progress. To answer some of Greg and Randy's questions, the Homes and HERA programs, the state's, which is going to focus on weatherization and electrification, and landlord programs with a giant focus on low income, so addressing the equity part of it. For you were talking about, Greg, $114 million to spend over the next 2 years or so. The tax credits will be available, hundreds of millions of dollars. 30% of investments in your homes and businesses can be in the tax credit. And if you don't pay taxes, or you're low income, you don't pay taxes, you can get a cash payment. So that's very low income and equity focused as well. State as a heat pump program, $50 to $100 million. Got a proposal in for $130 million for solar for all, with a giant low income focus. And if you're unfamiliar, the feds have a requirement called Justice 40 initiative, which means that grant applications have to show how 40% of the monies and benefits will go to disadvantaged and low income communities. So it's really geared towards that equity component. On energy resilience, Randy, there's a bill passed last year that allows energy resilient plans by counties. There's $2 million available for county grants to do that stuff. The state's also putting together an emergency energy resilience plan sometime in 2024. It's going to focus on the PDX fuel hub, but also our fuel hub with the tanks on River Road in Northwest Eugene, but also how do you maintain supply during emergencies, and how does that all work? But one of the big things that doesn't get talked about is jobs. Energy efficiency in Oregon alone provides over 45,000 jobs, and they're family wage jobs. They're good paying jobs. And this will increase with all this activity, plus the additional renewable energy and other climate packages for all these weatherization and all these other things that we're doing. So by leveraging these dollars, we're actually creating Eugene family wage jobs. And I think that shouldn't be lost in this conversation. It's hugely important. I think we should track that and figure that out, because I think it's going to be significant in the end. On the project manager, ODO alone has 3 people tracking all this federal stuff and dozens of people doing grants and implementation. And the state really realized that if we don't leverage this stuff, we're going to leave it on the table. So they stepped up with dollars and people, and throwing 1 or 2 people at this, I think we're going to leave millions of dollars on the table. And I encourage the city manager to reassess staffing on this, because you can leverage the federal grants to get staffing for this as well.
Okay, thank you. Matt.
Thanks, Mayor. Can you hear me? Just an audio check.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I appreciate Councilor Zelenka's observation about the economic impact and job creation piece in this sector. Ian, I greatly appreciate the presentation and the clarity. And my comments were going to revolve largely around points that Councillor Groves and Councillor Evans and Councillor Ye indicated. Tree preservation in particular. I often cite what I consider to be an inadequate tree preservation standard, and so I'm eager to see us lean in and do that work and secure vital federal funds and state funds to do so. The benchmark piece that was brought up by Councillors Evans and Ye is important to note, so I don't want to rehash all of those. So I will hone in on the engagement piece. Could you expand, please, on what, or share with council, what is an engagement wish list? Do you see us as a municipality going beyond the usual suspects? You know, engaging with neighbor associations is great, but who have we traditionally been missing in the engagement piece that would help bolster this work? And is there an opportunity, especially considering there are multiple benchmarks and metrics to be met at the state and federal level, for an engaging online dashboard for the public to monitor this work as it progresses?
I think to answer your second question first, yes, I like the idea of a dashboard or something like that to track some of that. I think that's a really interesting idea. In terms of like who we're trying to reach in the conversation we're trying to have, I think, yes, I think we're trying to have as broad as and expansive a conversation as we can, kind of within kind of the limitations of having 2 staff people focusing on this, plus trying to track IRA funding and all the federal and state opportunities that are out there as well. But I think in order to make, I think, effective policy recommendations and think about what are the things that we're missing or what are the areas that would be helpful to make sure that we can incorporate some of that information and figure out how to use these resources to speak to some of those challenges, we need to reach to some of those communities that we're not traditionally reaching. I think part of what we're doing now in terms of researching existing efforts and looking at some of the existing data is to do precisely that, to figure out, okay, you know, we have a lot of the people that we often go and talk to. Are there ways to kind of go beyond that? And I think, you know, in talking to the folks in the planning departments, some of our colleagues, I think we have some interesting ideas, maybe building off of some of the really unique strategies that we used in middle housing to think about how we can get information from people through some of their lived experiences and other ways that we can actually try and identify some of these opportunities and get information from parts of the community that maybe are, you know, not engaged, or showing them the opportunity to sort of how they can actually, you know, participate and provide feedback and play a role in this process. And this is a place where I think some of the federal resources are also helpful. Some of the environmental justice grants from EPA, one of their explicit focuses is on doing capacity building. So I think as we have some of these conversations with communities, are there ways in which the city can help bring resources here to help with some of that capacity building in some of these communities who have not necessarily had a seat at the table or a voice in the discussion, and use that as a way to kind of supplement some of that work. So I think we're thinking about all of that and trying to figure out how we can get as wide a swath of engagement and input into this process as we possibly can. I think that just benefits how we think about this and how we try to solve some of these problems.
Thank you. If it's helpful, I can only speak for, I'm only one of 8, but if it's helpful, we have individual networks as well. And I would offer myself, when mutually convenient, to engage in a town hall, if that's something your office is longing to explore, perhaps with the Sustainability Commission, perhaps with Friends of Trees. And so if there's an opportunity for more forward-facing engagement with individual counselors, put me down as an enthusiastic partner willing to help. Thanks for the work, Ian.
Great. Put you on the list.
All right. Thank you. Lindsay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Ian, for an excellent presentation. It's really exciting to see some action in our climate action plan goals. And also thank you for the timeline for the further conversations around future building. I look forward to hearing the conversations around that and more information. I also had similar kind of questions around the grant management, as Councilor Zelenka was referencing. Thank you for talking a little bit more about that capacity building within the grants. But yeah, I mean, I would hate to leave money on the table, as Alan was saying, because we don't have the capacity. And so I look forward to hearing more about that trajectory and what our staff are able to do, and what's going to come from where, because all of those different opportunities are super exciting. So again, thank you so much. This is really excellent work.
Thank you. Anybody else with comments? I'll just jump in for a minute and kind of from the back end of this conversation, moving forward. We did establish an equity panel as part of the CAP 2.0 process, and that was a way by providing some childcare and providing dinner and providing some compensation. It was a way of enabling people to engage. And we've carried that idea in my conversations at the EPA Local Government Advisory Committee. We've carried that model to other cities. So we have that. And Emily and I were just in a leadership meeting with Ian and Danielle with the Sustainability Commission, and we talked again about the opportunities for the Sustainability Commission has as their priority to do more outreach and engage in the community. So I think we have actually already built some good models, and we can do more. But adding on to what Ian already said, I just wanted to remind everyone about that. And I actually also did want to say that one of Ian's first points he made was that we would align our CAP 2.0 with some of these opportunities. And the council really needs to take some pride in that CAP 2.0, because it does give you the framework from which to start to actually figure out where does the city align and how do we position ourselves to do this work. And that's not a small thing. To be actually, and there are communities across the country that are struggling to figure out how can they respond and make the most of it. And then I just wanted to say a couple of maybe three other quick things. One is that Ian has talked about partnerships, and you'll all remember that in the CAP 2.0, the foundation of that was that Eugene Climate Collaborative and working with our larger partners. And so that sort of went on hiatus, but actually Ian and Danielle are now sort of in a position to have those conversations again, and we're seeing how critically important that is. These federal funds really do require that kind of collaboration and cooperation. They really want to see that, and the fact that we had that foundation and we have those relationships to build on puts us in a very good position. And then finally, the other thing I'll say is I was just yesterday in the meeting with the EPA Local Government Advisory Council Committee yesterday, and so many of the things that you have pointed out about Eugene's action and Eugene's response is exactly what we're talking about at the national level in terms of the sort of capacity building and how do you support communities and how do you do that equitable outreach and how do you create a dashboard. And I mean, all of those pieces are actually all part of the national conversation. And I will say that there is so much that this city has done, and with your leadership and the councilors that preceded you, so much of what you have done is really positioned you to really be a leader again in this work. So I just want to thank all of you and thank Ian really for a great presentation. So with that, I think if there are no other comments or questions, there's no other follow-up on this? I think we are good. Ian, I'm assuming you got plenty of information about what the councilors think is important and what they're looking forward to hearing from. So thank you all very much. Great meeting. And with that, we are adjourned.